welcome back to the Compliance Kitchen. This is Silvia, and today I thought we could take a look at the EU sanctions on Russia. There's a nice briefing that came from the European Parliamentary Research Service, and so I thought we could take a look at that because it outlines the EU sanctions on Russia, I think, quite nicely. So before we get into that, just the usual, whatever you hear on Compliance Kitchen is not legal advice and it should not be used as such. So going into this briefing, this came out, a couple weeks ago in March, and it's about 12 pages, but kind of to simplify it, I guess, and summarize it, there is a timeline of the EU sanctions, kind of showing the state of play, so to speak, and it starts with the 2014 illegal annexation of Crimea and Sevastopol. So this was the initial aggression from Russia on Ukraine, and that's when EU adopted some targeted sanctions and some diplomatic sanctions as well. Then we had the downing of the passenger flight, the MH17, the NotPetya cyber attack that was in 2017. Then we had the attempted poisoning of Sergei Skripal and his daughter. They were living in the UK at the time. That was in 2018. So EU continued to respond to all these acts with some degree of sanctions or some sanctions regimes that they implemented. Then we had the Alexei Navalny poisonings. That was in 2020, 2021. So with that came the EU Global Human Rights Sanctions regime. And then in 2022, as you all know, in February is when Russia started its full-scale attack against Ukraine. They recognized the two alleged republics, the Donetsk and Luhansk, as independent states, and then they started the full-scale invasion. So that's when EU responded with the other allied nations and started off with the first package of sanctions. And at this point, we are on package number 10, which was rolled out on the first year's anniversary of the Russian war on Ukraine. There was also, if you guys recall, in 2008, there was the Russia-Georgia war, and that did not result in any EU sanctions, even though Georgia did request smart sanctions back then. And initially in 2014, the EU sanctions were really against just the individual actors, members of the Russian elite, Ukrainian separatists, associated organizations, and the EU was just responding with individual sanctions, which would be typical asset freezes, travel bans, and diplomatic sanctions, where Russia was suspended from the G8. What followed later were broader economic sanctions and sectoral sanctions concerning certain sectors of the industry, so the energy sector, also arms trade, financial cooperations, and so forth. Then we had the chemical weapons and cyber attacks and human rights abuses, partly modeled after the US Global Magnitsky Act. And once the full-scale invasion took place, there was a whole lot more of coordination with other countries and allies, and also the G7. And we had what is labeled by some a sanctions revolution, because we have really not seen this type of coordination in the sanctions arena before. And each successive package, looking at the EU packages of sanctions on Russia, has incrementally amended and also widened the scope the previous scope of sanctions. And so at this point, it's a wide variety of restrictions. Of course, then the EU also added some sanctions against Belarus because of its support and involvement in the invasion of Ukraine, and also Iran recently because of the supply of Iranian drones into Russia's hands to use in Ukraine. The article gives us a list of the sanctions, which is a non-exhaustive list, but it's talking about the asset freezes, the travel bans, Russia's blocking access to Russia's central bank reserve holdings that was worth about 300 billion euros, banning transactions with certain Russian state-owned military industrial companies, disconnecting leading Russian financial institutions from the SWIFT system. Also, prohibition on exports to Russia of dual-use goods and technologies, ammunition, civilian firearms, military vehicles, and so forth that could be used in the invasion of Ukraine. Also banning certain exports in the aviation, maritime, and technology sectors for the same reason. Ban on exports of luxury goods to Russia. I will just mention really briefly this definition of luxury goods because the U.S. Export regulations also have a category of luxury goods in connection with the Russia restrictions imposed by the U.S. government, and that list is steadily expanding and growing into, and now it encompasses items that basically are everyday household, even appliances. So I wouldn't even call it luxury goods anymore. But so the point is that the list of restricted exports continues to grow in the US as well as in the EU. We know that the EU closed airspace, seaports, and roads to Russian aircraft, vessels, and transport operators. They also suspended various broadcasting activities of several Russian-owned, state-owned media outlets. And of course, there was a ban on imports of Russian coal and, as you know, the crude oil, as well as refined petroleum products. And of course, with that came the price cap on these products and prohibition of exports to Russia, goods or technologies in the oil refining sector, as well as prohibiting new investments in the Russian energy and mining sector. Could have been last week when the EU came out with restrictions on Russian nationals holding any positions in governing bodies of EU critical infrastructure and related entities. So that's I think one of the later restrictions or latest that came out of the EU. The paper also has a table that shows the EU sanctions against Russia. I thought that was kind of nice because it gives you the activity that's targeted by the sanctions, the type of sanction, what's the legal basis, when it was adopted, how often does it renew, when is the next renewal due, and then the scope, which tells you how many individuals and entities, for example, are targeted by this. Then the paper is moving on to the oil cap, the price cap on the Russian oil and refined products. Highlights that oil provides half of, or close to half of, Russia's budget revenue. But it also points out that while the price cap and the restrictions on the Russian oil exports were discussed, Russia had time to acquire about 100 old or older oil tankers that normally would be destined to be scrapped, but they were purchased, and it was for the purpose of shipping Russian oil outside of the scope of the sanctions and the price cap. the Russian government stepped in to provide insurance for these tankers so as to bypass UK shipping insurance companies. I guess there's the downside of the preparations that were going on for the price cap, and so that bought Russia some time to react. And another unknown is the so-called the dark fleet or the ghost ships, which you may have read about that, especially in the maritime world. So we don't know at this point how big is the fleet of these what they call the ghost ships. And again, those would be vessels that are carrying and engaging in ship-to-ship transfers of this Russian oil and refined petroleum products that are not being purchased at or below the price cap. So as the article states, it remains to be seen how well or whether the price cap is actually working. And it goes through different scenarios of what would it take for the price cap policy to be deemed a success, and situations under which the policy could fail, including involvement of third countries with significant refining production and large domestic demand, such as Turkey, India, or China, that might be interested in purchasing Russian oil and that are not rolling out sanctions against Russia. The article then moves on to sanctions effectiveness. Of course, you need two elements for that to work. You need alignment of multiple nations, which is we've achieved that somewhat with the Ukraine sanctions, and then you need to make sure that the sanctions are enforced. So the article highlights that while there is a very strong alignment around the sanctions from the G7 and all the allied nations, we also have about 2/3 of the world's population that live in countries that are taking kind of a neutral stance on the Russia-Ukraine situation. And some of them are key trading partners to Russia, such as Brazil, again, China, India, South Africa, and Turkey. And they do not currently impose sanctions on Russia. So this allows for a circumvention of the EU and US sanctions. The article then goes into EU enforcement and what the EU is doing in terms of trying to fight the circumvention of the sanctions. It also stresses the fact that it is up to the member states to enforce the regulations that are created at the EU level. The Commission has established an EU sanctions whistleblower tool. I think this was last year when they rolled that out. This is to anonymously collect information about violations of EU sanctions. There's also the Freeze and Seize task force that was set up recently to ensure efficient implementation of the sanctions against the listed Russian and Belarusian oligarchs. And of course, there is the repo task force. That's an international task force. That's the Russian elites, proxies, and oligarchs, or repo task force, under which the EU cooperates with Australia and the G7 countries. I talked about the repo task force in a prior podcast episode if you want to learn a little bit more about that. Finally, the article goes through the economic impact of the sanctions so far and discusses unemployment, inflation, exchange rate, trade in Russia. It talks about the fact that while the sanctions have been very impressive, it was not, and Russia was not entirely surprised by them, and so the Russian government was able to plan and implement some policies to kind of soften the economic blow from the sanctions. And finally, it takes us to the current position of the European Parliament, which intends to intensify its outreach to those countries that have not yet joined the EU in introducing sanctions against Russia. Also heavily getting ready to prosecute circumvention of the sanctions. Again, this is something that falls on the member states. It talks more about strict enforcement of the sanctions, and then the Parliament's call again for the EU member states and allies to work on a secondary sanctions mechanism that would be designed to close any loopholes so that it lessens the possibility of circumvention. So as you know, that the US sanction regime contains secondary sanctions, so it will be interesting to see what form the proposed secondary sanctions mechanism will take in the EU if they move in that direction. So that's kind of in a nutshell this briefing, as they call it, that I found to be a good resource, especially if you are practicing in the sanctions area in the EU or EU sanctions area. Again, this is, of course, available on the website. It was published by the European Parliamentary Research Service, and it came out this month in March. So if you want to take a look at that, they have it available for you. If you need a copy, you can email me. It's email@compliancekitchen.com, and I'm happy to send you a copy or just send you the link. I will hopefully talk to you next week.